Judge Elizabeth Crawford adjusted her black robes as she settled into her chair behind the tall wooden bench. The London courthouse was busy this Tuesday morning, with a long line of cases waiting to be heard. She had been doing this job for 15 years, and she felt confident that she could read people quickly and make the right decisions. Her grey hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her sharp blue eyes looked serious behind her reading glasses. The courtroom was cold, and the old heating system made strange noises that echoed through the large room. Outside, rain tapped against the tall windows, creating a gloomy atmosphere that matched the judge's stern mood. At exactly 9:30, the court clerk called the next case. Grace Williams, traffic violation, speeding on the M25 motorway. A young black woman in her early 30s walked through the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. Grace wore a simple grey sweater and dark jeans that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she looked tired, as if she had not slept well the night before. She carried a small handbag and walked with quiet dignity toward the front of the room. Judge Crawford barely looked up from her papers as she called out the name. Grace Williams. Yes, Your Honor. Grace replied politely, standing straight with her hands clasped in front of her. Her voice was clear and respectful, but there was a hint of nervousness that she tried to hide. Judge Crawford finally lifted her eyes and took a quick look at the woman standing before her. In that brief moment, she made several assumptions based on what she saw. Here was a young woman who probably worked in some low-paying job, maybe cleaning offices or working in a shop. Her clothes were plain and inexpensive. She looked like someone who might have dropped out of school early and never learned to make good choices in life. The judge flipped through the case file without much interest. You were caught driving 20 miles over the speed limit on a busy motorway. That's dangerous driving that puts other people at risk. Grace shifted slightly but kept her respectful posture. Your Honor, I was rushing to an important meeting, but I know that's no excuse for breaking the law. I take full responsibility for my actions. Judge Crawford heard the words, but had already decided what kind of person Grace was. She thought, this young woman needed to learn a hard lesson about following rules and respecting authority. In her mind, being tough would help Grace become a better citizen. Speeding is not just about you, the judge said in a cold, lecturing tone. It's about everyone else on the road who could be hurt by your reckless behavior. It shows you don't respect the law or think about the consequences of your actions. Grace felt her cheeks grow warm with embarrassment, but she kept her eyes focused on the judge and said nothing. She had learned long ago that arguing with people in authority rarely helped her situation. Judge Crawford continued her harsh speech. I see too many people like you who think the rules don't apply to them. Maybe a strong punishment will help you make better choices in the future. The words stung Grace deeply. She wanted to explain that she was actually very careful about following rules and that this was the first time she had ever been in trouble with the law. She wanted to tell the judge about the important work she did and how much she cared about helping people. But she knew that speaking up might only make things worse. I'm giving you the maximum penalty allowed by law, Judge Crawford announced. A fine of £500 and 40 hours of community service. This will give you time to think about your actions and hopefully teach you some responsibility. Grace felt her heart sink into her stomach. £500 was a lot of money, more than she could easily afford even with her good salary. The community service would mean taking time away from her demanding job, which would create problems for her colleagues and the important cases she was working on. But Grace had been taught to show respect to judges and courts. Even when she disagreed with their decisions, she took a deep breath and nodded. I understand, Your Honor. Thank you, as Grace turned to leave the courtroom. Judge Crawford was already looking at the next file on her desk. She had forgotten about Grace Williams. Before the young woman had even walked out the door, the judge felt satisfied that she had done her job well by being firm and teaching someone a valuable lesson. Grace walked slowly through the courthouse corridors, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. She felt hurt and disappointed, not just by the harsh punishment, but by the way the judge had spoken to her as if she were a child who needed to be scolded. She had been treated as if she was someone who couldn't be trusted to make good decisions or contribute anything valuable to society. Outside the courthouse, Grace stood in the rain for a moment. Letting the cold drops wash over her face, she thought about the irony of her situation, but she didn't let anger take control of her emotions. Instead, she pulled out her phone and made arrangements to handle the fine and community service requirement. Sometimes life has strange ways of teaching people important lessons, though they don't always learn them right away. 3 weeks after the courtroom incident, Judge Crawford woke up early on a Saturday morning and put on her best navy blue suit. Today was the annual Legal Excellence Conference at the Royal Courts of Justice, one of the most important events of the year for judges and lawyers across England. She had been looking forward to this day for months because it was a chance to learn about new developments in the law and network with other legal peers. The drive through London took longer than usual because of weekend traffic, but Judge Crawford didn't mind. She enjoyed these conferences because they made her feel part of something bigger than a daily routine in the courthouse. She parked her car in the designated area and walked toward the impressive stone building that housed the Royal Courts of Justice. The grand conference hall was buzzing with activity when she arrived. Hundreds of people in expensive suits were standing round in small groups, drinking coffee and discussing their cases. Judge Crawford recognized many faces from previous conferences and legal publications. These were some of the most successful judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys in the country. She picked up her name tag and conference materials from the registration table and found a seat in the middle section of the large auditorium. The morning keynote speaker was supposed to be particularly interesting, according to the conference program. The speaker was described as a rising star in federal prosecution who had recently won a landmark civil rights case that would change how discrimination cases were handled in the future. Judge Crawford settled into her comfortable padded seat and opened her conference folder. She pulled out the program and read more details about the morning presentation. The topic was equal justice under law, challenges and opportunities in modern legal practice. It sounded like exactly the kind of serious, intellectual discussion she enjoyed. At precisely 10 o'clock, the conference chairman walked onto the stage. He was a distinguished older man with white hair who had been organizing these events for over 20 years. He tapped the microphone to get everyone's attention, and the buzz of conversation gradually died down. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," he said in a clear, authoritative voice that carried easily through the large hall. "Welcome to our annual Legal Excellence Conference. We have an exceptional program planned for you today, starting with our keynote speaker." Judge Crawford took a sip of her coffee and settled back to listen. She always enjoyed hearing from successful prosecutors because their work was closely connected to her own role as a judge. "Our speaker this morning," the chairman continued, "is someone who has made remarkable contributions to the field of civil rights law in a very short time. She graduated at the top of her class from Oxford Law School and spent her early career as a public defender, representing people who could not afford legal representation." Judge Crawford nodded approvingly. She respected lawyers who had worked with poor clients because it showed they cared about justice for everyone, not just wealthy people who could pay high legal fees. After building an excellent reputation as a defense attorney, The chairman went on. She moved into federal prosecution, where she has focused specifically on civil rights violations. Just last month, she won a major case against a large corporation that had been discriminating against minority employees for years. This victory will help protect thousands of workers from similar treatment in the future. The audience began to applaud, and Judge Crawford joined in. She was curious to see this accomplished young prosecutor and hear what insights she might share. "Ladies and gentlemen," the chairman announced with a smile, "please give a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Federal Prosecutor Grace Williams." Judge Crawford's coffee cup tilted dangerously in her hand, and she had to grab it quickly to prevent it from spilling all over her expensive suit. Her mouth fell open in complete shock as she watched a familiar figure walk confidently onto the stage. It was the same young black woman she had sentenced so harshly just 3 weeks earlier. But Grace looked completely different now. Instead of the tired woman in simple clothes who had stood before her bench, this Grace Williams wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray business suit and walked with the confident stride of someone who belonged on stages like this. Her hair was styled professionally, and she carried herself with the poise of someone who regularly spoke to important audiences. This was clearly a woman who was comfortable in positions of authority and respect. Judge Crawford felt her stomach drop as if she were falling from a great height. The woman she had treated like an uneducated troublemaker was actually one of the most successful prosecutors in the country. The person she had lectured about making better choices had graduated from Oxford Law School and was winning cases that would help protect people's civil rights. As Grace began her presentation about fairness and equal treatment under the law, her clear, intelligent voice filled the auditorium. She spoke eloquently about the importance of judges and prosecutors working together to ensure that all people received equal justice, regardless of their race, economic status, or appearance. Judge Crawford sat frozen in her seat, every word hitting her like a physical blow. She realized with horrible clarity that she had failed to follow the very principles that Grace was now explaining to the audience. She had judged someone based on their appearance rather than treating them with the dignity and fairness that every person deserved in a courtroom. Judge Crawford lay in her bed that night, staring at the ceiling as the hours slowly passed. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Grace Williams standing confidently on that stage, speaking about equal justice with such intelligence and passion. The image was burned into her mind, and sleep seemed impossible. She kept replaying the moment in her courtroom 3 weeks earlier, remembering how she had looked at Grace and made instant judgments about who she was and what she deserved. The memory made her feel sick with shame. How could she have been so wrong about someone? How could she have treated such an accomplished person with such disrespect? At 3 in the morning, Judge Crawford got up and made herself a cup of tea. She sat at her kitchen table in her pajamas, still thinking about what had happened. The worst part was not just that she had misjudged Grace, but that she was beginning to wonder if she had done the same thing to other people over the years. When morning finally came, Judge Crawford called her office and told her assistant that she would be working from home for the day. She had never done this before, but she felt compelled to look more closely at her own behavior as a judge. She drove to the courthouse and went to the records office, where all the old case files were stored. The clerk was surprised to see her there on a Sunday, but he helped her gather the files she requested. Judge Crawford carried several boxes of files back to her car and drove home. In her study, she spread the files across her desk and began what would be the most difficult examination of her career. She decided to look at traffic violation cases first, since that was similar to Grace's situation. She pulled out dozens of files from the past 2 years and began comparing the punishments she had given to different people. What she discovered made her feel even worse than she had the night Before, when she looked at the cases involving white defendants who appeared well-dressed and educated, she noticed that she had often given them warnings or minimum fines. Even when their violations were serious, she had accepted their explanations and shown them mercy. But when she looked at cases involving people of color, or people who appeared poor or less educated, she saw a completely different pattern. These defendants had received much harsher punishments for the same crimes. She had given them maximum fines, community service, and stern lectures about responsibility and making better choices. Judge Crawford put down the files and rubbed her temples. She had never consciously decided to treat people differently based on their race or appearance, but the evidence was right there in black and white. Her unconscious biases had been affecting her decisions for years, and she had never even noticed. She spent the entire day going through more files, looking at different types of cases. The pattern was consistent and undeniable. She had been much more lenient with defendants who looked like her and much harsher with those who did not. Meanwhile, across the city, Grace Williams was in her office at the federal courthouse, working on a new civil rights case. She had not told any of her colleagues about what had happened in Judge Crawford's courtroom. Grace believed in handling personal matters privately, and she did not want to damage the judge's reputation based on one incident. Grace treated every case that came across her desk with the same careful attention and fairness. Whether the defendant was a wealthy businessman or a homeless person, she had learned early in her career that justice meant treating all people with equal dignity and respect, regardless of their background or appearance. Back in her study, Judge Crawford continued her painful self-examination. She pulled out books from her law school days and began reading about judicial bias and prejudice. She had studied these concepts briefly in school, but she had never thought they applied to her own behavior. As the weeks passed, Judge Crawford became consumed with understanding how she had developed these unconscious biases. She ordered books about psychology and sociology, trying to learn about the mental shortcuts that had led her to make unfair judgments about people. She read about something called implicit bias, which explained how people could have prejudiced thoughts without being aware of them. She learned that even people who genuinely believed in equality could still be influenced by stereotypes and assumptions that they had absorbed from society over many years. The more she read, the more shame she felt, but also the more determined she became to change. She realized that her intentions had never been to treat people unfairly, but her impact had been harmful regardless of her intentions. Judge Crawford wanted desperately to apologize to Grace, but she felt paralyzed by shame. How could she approach such an accomplished woman and admit that she had let her unconscious prejudices affect her professional judgment? What words could possibly express how sorry she was for treating Grace so poorly? She practiced conversations in her mind, imagining what she would say if she had the courage to call Grace's office. But every imagined conversation seemed inadequate. How do you apologize for failing to see someone's humanity and treating them as less than they deserved for weeks? Judge Crawford carried this heavy burden of guilt. She knew she had to find a way to make things right, not just with Grace, but with all the people she had treated unfairly over the years. She had to find the courage to face her mistakes and figure out how to become the judge she should have been all along. For 31 days, Judge Crawford had been carrying the weight of her mistake like a heavy stone in her chest. She would wake up every morning thinking about Grace Williams and go to bed every night feeling ashamed of how she had treated her. The guilt was eating away at her, making it hard to concentrate on her work and impossible to enjoy the simple pleasures of life on a gray Thursday morning. Judge Crawford sat in her chambers staring at her phone. She had looked up Grace's office number at the federal courthouse several times over the past weeks, But each time she had lost her nerve before dialing. Today felt different somehow. She knew that if she didn't act soon, she would never find the courage to do what needed to be done. Her hands shook slightly as she picked up the phone and dialed the number. The receptionist at the federal prosecutor's office answered in a professional voice, and Judge Crawford asked to speak with Grace Williams. "May I ask who's calling?" the receptionist inquired. "This is Judge Elizabeth Crawford from the London Municipal Court," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a brief pause. And then the receptionist said, "Please hold while I see if Miss Williams is available." Judge Crawford's heart pounded as she waited. She almost hung up the phone twice during those few minutes, but she forced herself to stay on the line. When Grace's voice came through the phone, it sounded surprised but polite. "Judge Crawford, this is unexpected. How can I help you?" Judge Crawford took a deep breath and tried to keep her voice steady. "Ms. Williams, I wonder if we could meet privately. I have something very important to discuss with you. It's about what happened in my courtroom a few weeks ago." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Judge Crawford could almost hear Grace thinking, weighing whether this meeting was a good idea or not. Finally, Grace spoke. "I suppose we could meet. There's a small coffee shop called the Daily Grind about 2 blocks from the courthouse. Would tomorrow afternoon work for you?" "Yes, that would be perfect. Thank you for agreeing to see me," Judge Crawford said, feeling both relieved and terrified at the same time. The next afternoon, Judge Crawford arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early. She chose a quiet table in the corner, away from other customers, and ordered a cup of tea that she didn't really want. Her stomach was too nervous to handle caffeine, but she needed something to do with her hands. When Grace walked through the door, Judge Crawford recognized her immediately. Even though she was dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, Grace looked round the small cafe until she spotted the judge. Then walked over with measured steps. "Judge Crawford," Grace said formally, extending her hand for a brief handshake before sitting down across from her. "Thank you for coming," Judge Crawford replied. "Can I get you something to drink?" "Just water, please," Grace said, settling into her chair and folding her hands on the table. Judge Crawford went to the counter and returned with a bottle of water, using those few moments to gather her thoughts one last time. When she sat back down, she looked directly into Grace's eyes and began the most difficult conversation of her professional career. "Grace, I need to start by saying that I owe you a sincere and heartfelt apology. The way I treated you in my courtroom was completely wrong, and I have been thinking about it every day since I saw you speak at the conference." Grace's expression remained neutral, but Judge Crawford could see the pain in her eyes as she remembered that day in court. "I made assumptions about you based entirely on how you looked when you appeared before me," Judge Crawford continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "I saw a young black woman in simple clothes, and I decided without knowing anything about you that you needed to be taught a harsh lesson. I gave you a punishment that was far too severe, and I spoke to you in a way that was disrespectful and wrong." Grace listened without interrupting, her face showing a mixture of hurt and careful attention. Judge Crawford pressed on, knowing that she had to say everything that was in her heart. "I failed as a judge that day, but more importantly, I failed as a human being. I let my unconscious biases and prejudices affect my judgment, and I treated you unfairly because of the color of your skin and the assumptions I made about your background." She paused to take a shaky breath before continuing. "After seeing you at the conference, I went back and looked at my old cases. What I found made me feel sick. This wasn't the first time I had treated people differently based on their race or appearance. I've been unconsciously giving harsher punishments to people of color and more lenient sentences to white defendants for the same crimes. I never realized I was doing it. But that doesn't make it any less wrong. Grace was quiet for a long moment, processing everything the judge had said. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but filled with strength and wisdom. "Judge Crawford, what you did that day hurt me very deeply. I left your courtroom feeling like I had been judged not for my actions, but for who you thought I was based on how I looked. That kind of treatment is something I've experienced before, but it never gets easier." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes meeting the judge's directly. "But I see people struggle with bias every day in my work as a prosecutor. The important thing is that you're willing to admit your mistake and take responsibility for it. That takes real courage, and it's the first step toward making real change." Judge Crawford left the coffee shop that afternoon feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Grace's words about turning her mistake into positive change had given her something she desperately needed: a sense of purpose and hope. She drove straight home and immediately began researching everything she could find about unconscious bias in the legal system. The very next morning, Judge Crawford called the Judicial Training Institute and signed up for their next workshop on implicit bias awareness. She also ordered several books written by experts on racial prejudice and fairness in courtrooms. For the first time since the conference, she felt like she was doing something constructive instead of just feeling guilty. Within a week, Judge Crawford had contacted Grace again with an unusual proposal. She wanted to create a special training program that would help other judges recognize and address their own biases. Most judges would never admit to having such problems, but Judge Crawford believed that her personal story might help them understand how easily prejudice could creep into their decisions without them realizing it. Grace was initially surprised by the suggestion, but she quickly saw the potential value in such a program. As a federal prosecutor who dealt with civil rights cases every day, she knew how common these problems were throughout the justice system. She agreed to work with Judge Crawford to develop workshops that could make a real difference. They met every Saturday morning for 2 months, carefully planning their educational program. Judge Crawford shared the painful findings from a review of old cases, while Grace contributed her knowledge of legal precedents and civil rights law together. They created presentations that were both educational and deeply personal. Meanwhile, Judge Crawford began making immediate changes in her own courtroom. She started each day by reminding herself to look at every person who appeared before her as an individual worthy of respect and fair treatment. She made a conscious effort to listen more carefully to people's explanations and to consider their circumstances before making decisions. When a young man appeared before her for a minor theft charge, Judge Crawford took time to learn about his situation. She discovered that he had been trying to feed his younger siblings after their mother lost her job, instead of giving him the maximum penalty. She connected him with social services and community programs that could help his family. She still held him accountable for his actions, but she treated him with dignity and compassion. Word began to spread throughout the courthouse that something had changed about Judge Crawford. Lawyers noticed that she was more patient and thoughtful in her decisions. Court clerks observed that she treated all defendants with the same level of respect, regardless of their appearance or background. 6 months after their first coffee short meeting, Judge Crawford and Grace received an invitation to speak at the National Conference on Judicial Excellence. The organizers had heard about their collaboration and wanted them to share their story with judges from across the country. Standing on the stage together, Judge Crawford felt nervous but determined. She looked out at the audience of hundreds of legal professionals and began to tell her story. She explained how she had unconsciously let her biases affect her judgments, and how Grace had helped her see the need for a change. "I stand before you today not as someone who has always done the right thing, but as someone who made serious mistakes and learned from them. Judge Crawford said to the quiet audience, "Change is possible, but it requires us to be completely honest about our failures and willing to do the difficult work of examining our own hearts and minds." Grace stepped forward to address the audience next. Judge Crawford's willingness to face her mistakes and work for change shows us something important about justice. It's not just about following the letter of the law or applying rules correctly. True justice means treating every person who enters our courtrooms with dignity and fairness, no matter who they are or where they come from. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause, and many judges approached them afterward to ask about implementing similar training programs in their own jurisdictions. Their presentation had touched something important in people who genuinely wanted to serve justice fairly. Over the following months, Judge Crawford and Grace traveled to courthouses throughout England, leading workshops and sharing their message. Their unlikely partnership became well known in legal communities, inspiring other judges to examine their own practices and make necessary changes. Judge Crawford's courtroom became famous as a place where everyone received equal treatment under the law. Young lawyers often requested to observe her court sessions so they could learn from her example. Legal students wrote papers about her transformation and the importance of confronting unconscious bias in the justice system. Grace continued her important work as a federal prosecutor, but she also found deep satisfaction in her educational efforts with Judge Crawford. She had turned a painful personal experience into an opportunity to create positive change throughout the legal system. 3 years later, both women attended a celebration marking the success of their bias awareness program, which had been adopted by courts throughout the country. As they stood together watching a new group of judges graduate from their training workshop, they reflected on how much had changed since the difficult day in the courtroom. What had begun as Judge Crawford's worst professional mistake had become the foundation for a friendship built on honesty, forgiveness, and shared commitment to justice. Their story proved that even the most painful mistakes could be transformed into opportunities for growth and positive change when people had the courage to face their failures and work together to build something better. The end.